So, I reflecting on what you're all gathered here today. I think it's extremely important work. Looks like this one broke. I'm going to sit over on this one. The kind of neoliberal and market-based economy is certainly good for some things, but there's a lot of shortcomings. And while the sort of late 20th and early 21st century, the neoliberal economic model kind of defeated other alternative models that were even more flawed in many ways. And where it certainly maximizes productivity, it's not an economic form that incorporates multiple stakeholders. And I think that that's a lot about what you're here to talk about today. So while value is created, the value not only generally resides with shareholders and owners, it actually has to, because under the construct of the corporation, the fiduciary responsibility of the directors that run it is to the shareholders. It's not to the customers, it's not to the employees, it's not to the environment, it's to the shareholders. And when you measure something and when you have that level of responsibility, you do maximize productivity. So it turns out there's been tremendous growth in shareholder value, tremendous wealth creation. The problem has largely been twofold. It's maybe hold it a little further, sort of twofold. If you can't hear me, maybe start raising your hand. It's a little hard for me to tell how loud it is. So while great value has been created and continues to be created, the two main problems with it are that it accrues to the benefit of the few rather than everybody. And two, there is no accounting for the lack of sustainability and for environmental and other externalities that are caused by the growth in equity for shareholders. So we need a better way to go about it. And the sort of current and prevailing and old paradigm in Washington has always been, well, let's find a way to regulate and stop those bad things like pollution and externalities. Let's find a way through a redistributive tax system to have a higher marginal rate for high-income individuals and a social safety net for low-income individuals. And that approach has held it together like a patchwork, but it hasn't addressed by any means the systemic drivers of both the destruction of our environment as well as the increasing wealth gap between the wealthiest 1.5% and everybody else. So I think what we hope that your work produces is an alternative model. And a model, we also have examples in the dustbins of history of what doesn't work in the 20th century, whether it's the idealistic attempts at communist models, whether it's socialist models where they lack the right incentives with government ownership of enterprise, a wide variety of models that were, designed with similar goals in mind, but fell short for a variety of reasons. I know that we can do better as a world, as a society, as a country. We see a smattering of ideas, whether it's B Corps, whether it's one I want to talk about in a minute, which is fostering employee ownership of enterprises. But we know that there's a better way to get there. One of those ideas that I wanted to touch upon is how we can have and encourage employee and worker ownership across our economy so that a share of the value that's created goes to the benefit of the workers and the employees in an enterprise as stakeholders, where they join their brethren stakeholders with that shareholder hat. Now, again, this only addresses the economic disparity issue. We still have environmental and other externality issues. But in terms of value being created, especially with the decline in the late 20th century and early 21st of the union movement, there's been little check on almost all of that value accruing to the sole benefit of the shareholders. So there's a number of methods to do this. There's companies in Boulder and Fort Collins and across Colorado that do this every day. ESOPs, employee-owned stock programs. Some of the breweries have those. Co-ops are another model for employee ownership. And direct employee ownership or stock options are also methods that are seen, stock options, particularly in high growth and technology industries. So these are methods to better align the incentives and the reward structure for the workers at all levels, from entry level line workers all the way up through management, with the shareholders so that they become one and the same over time. And I'm very supportive of efforts both within tax policy, regulatory policy, to make it easier and culturally acceptable and prevalent for employee-owned operations, either partially or wholly. Now, the environment has eluded, proper accountability for environmental externalities has eluded us as a country and as a world, and it's eluded us for a reason. I think the biggest reason is that it is in the vested interest of corporations that pollute to co-opt the political system to prevent any type of solution that prevents them from polluting. That goes for air, it goes for water, it goes for plastic waste, it goes for every type of waste imaginable. So there is a unfathomably large incumbent constituency for not pricing or ending unsustainable practices. Oh, there we go. That's a political question, right? But it makes it politically challenging, but we also lack imagination. That's where we need you to come in. The approach which we have is, well, let's limit pollution. Let's try to put caps on the amount of methane that's emitted. Let's try to say that there's a penalty for, plastic waste that isn't recycled. Let's try to make sure that toxic waste doesn't go into the dump and goes to other sites. And we have all these laws, and they've held it together, but as you know, they're at a breaking point, right? Now, we see this writ large with climate, right? But even in other areas, when you look at the vast areas of the ocean covered in plastic refuse, when you look at the deteriorating water quality, when you look at air quality from a health perspective, you see that we have fallen short through this sort of conventional regulatory approach. So what needs to occur is a transformation in the very rules of capitalism, which you're working on here today, and I hope to learn from you some of those solutions, to build into the very system the element of sustainability that our current system so sorely lacks in favor of short-term productivity. And the dangers of short-term productivity are even greater with regard to, let's say, our public stock markets, where everything is about the quarter. Forget about even the year or the 5 years. It's about the quarter at the expense of future quarters. What we need to move to is a metric system, a way of evaluating the success or failure of companies, the valuation of companies, that looks at the long-term value proposition that's sustainable over time. So it's not what you can produce this quarter or even this year. It's what can you produce over the long term, over a year, 5 years, 10 years, the legacy over 50 years and 100 years, both positive and negative, somehow, that's up to you, not me, you have to figure this out, being tracked back for kind of affecting the net present value of the enterprise today. No one says it's easy, but we know that it's entirely lacking from our current system, which exclusively values shareholder profits, puts companies in a position where they succeed by gaming or creating loopholes within the system to allow them to pollute more, to allow them to pay workers less. And they are, in fact, rewarded for that very behavior. So they do it. That's not a immoral, it's an amoral thing. It's amoral. That's what they're rewarded to do. We set up a system that says we will reward you for paying your workers less and polluting the environment more as long as you don't get fined or do it illegally. So that is what they try to do, because that is what we have defined success as. So the challenge is to find success in a more inclusive and sustainable way that works. And, again, I think the shortcomings of some of the prior models are that they did not incentivize an aspect that is incentivized today, and that is productivity. And guess what? Productivity is important. You don't want to improve equity at the expense of productivity, or everybody winds up less well off. So it's very challenging. I mean, if this was easy stuff, we'd have a sustainable, inclusive global economy today. It's not, but I think the systemic failures of the current neoliberal system are becoming more and more apparent over time, both with regard to climate, with regard to health and welfare, with regard to the increasing wealth gap. And those are reaching alarming proportions. And we're seeing that in our politics, With the rise of the extremes across the world, previously marginalized solutions for frustrating people turning to authoritarian leaders on the right or the left, people who offer a rejection of the status quo without, in their case, the intellectual underpinnings of a replacement, such as the concept that you are working on and will evolve. And that's a legitimate frustration that people in our country have that led to the election of Trump, that people in other countries have had that led to the remarkable success of formerly marginalized radical parties at the expense of mainstream political parties of the left and the right. And that will continue to happen as a wake-up call to thought leaders that we need to do better. We need to do better with regard to both inclusivity as well as sustainability in creating a new economic model that works in the long run for everybody. And that is the challenge that I know you all are up to. I look forward to hearing about your deliberations over the next day. And again, some of them are in the economic realm, some might be in the political realm. But know that the task ahead of you is not an easy one. With that, I would be happy to take a couple questions. Mhm. Mhm. Well, we're trying to let them think it's their idea. So it's the only way it's going to happen, and it's very unlikely. But look, there is a general desire to do something called tax reform. Tax reform would involve eliminating loopholes in tax expenditures and substantially bringing down rates for both corporations and individuals. Not a bad thing. It's a laudable goal. The key challenge is there needs to be revenue in that equation. Now, there's two current approaches by Republicans who, of course, are driving this, both of which have major fallacies. The House Republican proposal, the Paul Ryan proposal, Kevin Brady proposal, is to have a very large border adjustment tax of 20% on all imported products and to use that to give tax breaks to everybody, in particular the wealthy, but everybody. The main problem with the 20% tariff, border adjustment tax, is it's very regressive because it is in effect a sales tax. So think of everything that you buy, your socks, your shoes, all of that imported, costing 20% more. That affects low and middle income individuals, whereas a proportion of the benefits are giving to higher income individuals. It is a more regressive tax than a carbon tax. Now we'll get to a carbon tax, and you need to have, as you said, have some sort of dividend or alternative aspect to the equation to make sure it's not regressive. But even starting off, a carbon tax is less regressive than a border adjustment tax. It's hard to think of something that is more regressive than a border adjustment tax. The other problem with it is it'll cost American jobs as other countries reciprocate and add a 20% tariff to our products that are exported. So it's highly problematic. So President Trump didn't even want to touch that. He just said, let's just cut taxes, especially for the rich, but for everybody, and not pay for it at all, and basically triple our deficit and borrow from the future and make all of your kids and grandkids pay. Now, the good news is I don't even think the House and Senate Republicans are that fiscally irresponsible that they're going to go for that. And very few serious individuals have risen in support of a large unpaid for tax reform package. Doesn't mean Republicans haven't historically supported, as they have with President Bush, smaller unpaid for tax reform reductions. But this is by scope enormous, and I don't expect that they will proceed with cutting everybody's rates without getting some revenue back in terms of closing loopholes or some alternative. Now, into that mix, we, from our side, as progressives, would offer the carbon tax. And we did so through a effort that I spearheaded, the Sustainable Energy and Environmental Caucus. It's a group of 52 Democrats, so it's about a little more than a quarter of the Democrats in the House that are the more environmentally oriented Democrats, where we said if tax reform moves forward, we would like to see the carbon tax as the center of it. And that's a way that then Democrats can feel good about supporting it, even if you do all this other stuff in it that we don't like, which they write the rules and they'll decide, and it won't all be perfect. But if the carbon tax is the center of it, I think we could bring a good number of Democratic votes for that. We also put in there a number of other environmental tax priorities, production tax credit, incentives for solar. We had about 20 or so other eliminating oil and gas tax loopholes and expenditures that are particularly for that industry. So that produces revenue. So we had a number of things in there, but carbon tax first and foremost. So clearly we were just showing, projecting. I've talked to Kevin Brady about it. I've talked to Speaker Ryan about it. I said, look, if you want Democratic support, this is a good way to go. All that being said, I still am very skeptical that that's the way they'll go. I hope that George Shultz and Bob English and the others succeed. It is a way where President Trump and the Republicans could salvage victory out of the jaws of defeat for tax reform. I do believe that if that is the centerpiece, it would fundamentally be attractive to attracting my vote and the vote of many Democrats. Besides a brief trial bubble from Trump that maybe he was open to it, which was shortly thereafter shut down, we just haven't seen much openness to that. So we certainly do talk about it, but again, I was only half joking when I said we also want them to think it's their idea if they come forward with it, and we'll be happy to work with them on something along those lines. I just wouldn't hold my breath, but we can't give up trying. Yes. Well, you hit a lot of things there. The healthcare bill. Well, I'm not sure. He said he said that the increased homelessness was one of the issues he was worried about. The repeal of the healthcare bill was the other, and I guess yeah, yeah. The healthcare bill does affect homelessness. There's no doubt about that. One of the biggest reasons for people to lose their homes is medically related bankruptcy if they're uninsured. That decreased significantly with the increase in number of people that were covered. Under the House Republican proposal to replace the Affordable Care Act, 24 million people would lose their health care as scored by the Congressional Budget Office. Now we're waiting on a new score with their changes, but we don't expect it to be any better. It might even be worse. Now, again, this is far from across the finish line. The Senate Republicans have said we're not even starting with the bill that the House passed. We're just going to secretly meet in a room, all 12 of us and all of our whiteness, all 12 of us and all of our maleness and all of our whiteness will meet in a secret room, and we will emerge with something. And we don't know what that is. And we think that they might. So that will be a different bill. So we will look at that and we will see what it does. But presumably, it would be along the same lines of reducing the number of Americans who have access to coverage, potentially particularly hitting people that are in the kind of 52 to 64 age group, particularly hitting people with pre-existing conditions. And will also, what we worry about again from the House bill, actually make healthcare more expensive for those who don't even lose it. 15 to 20% increases over the next few years for people who have healthcare today. So again, it contributes to homelessness. There's no doubt. There's a lot of issues that contribute to homelessness. I've talked to many mental health providers and shelters, and obviously mental health is an issue, and substance abuse is an issue. Lack of substance abuse treatment. In many ways, the criminalization of substance abuse rather than dealing with it as a health issue. So there's a variety of issues there, and we could also, I'm sure, talk about homelessness for a whole hour. But I know the focus here is kind of how you create an economy that works for everybody. Inevitably, that would also lead to less people kind of falling through those cracks in a current system, which doesn't really have the incentive to keep people on board. Yeah. Oh. Well, again, we operate in the world we operate in. I think that certainly many of the policies that I would support would be a broader prosperity agenda. So I haven't used those terms before, but that's a good way of kind of encompassing it. How do we create a broad prosperity agenda, as in a contrast to what you call the enrichment agenda? Now there's a whole question of what are the policies and tactics to implement them that come under that. But that's a excellent way of stating the goal of where we want to be. It's one that has certainly withered and been reduced over the last few decades. I mean, we've all witnessed that, and that's one of the reasons that we're looking for new solutions. We still need to address the sustainability piece, right? There's the equity piece, there's the inclusiveness piece. There's also a very legitimate and important sustainability piece. But absolutely, that's a good way of putting it, and I agree. Thank you.